The studio light struck like the sudden flare of a courtroom spotlight. Every shadow retreated, every angle sharpened. Rows of faces leaned in, eyes bright under the gloss of television anticipation. Somewhere in the upper tier, a cough broke. The silence, but it was drowned out by the low murmur of the live audience, an undercurrent of restless energy, waiting for something. Combustibl. Anne Hathaway stepped onto the stage with the elegance of someone used to being looked at, but not always understood. Her frame was straight, almost too straight, as though posture could be both shield and weapon. She wore a dark, understated dress, not a statement piece, but something that allowed her eyes to speak. And they did, searching, aware, cautious. The smile she offered the panel was polite, calibrated, a quiet signal that she was here to speak carefully, but without fear. Joy Behar wasted no time. She leaned forward, elbows pressing into the desk, voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and sharpened steel. "Tell us, Miss Hathaway," she said, the words slicing the air, "are stars responsible for misinforming voters simply by virtue of their fame?" The question landed with a thud, heavier than the studio's ambient hum. Hathaway's lips curved, but the smile faltered at the edges. She adjusted the microphone 1 second too long, and then answered, voice smooth, but edged with something unspoken. She spoke about civic responsibility, about encouraging awareness without claiming authority. Joy's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't your platform carry weight, and isn't that dangerous?" The room shifted. A ripple moved through the audience. And in that instant, under the glare of the lights and the unblinking gaze of millions at home, the battle lines, moral, ideological, deeply human, were drawn. The moment lingered in the air, taut as a pulled thread. Joy's question hadn't simply been about celebrity. It had been about culpability. The audience knew it, Anne knew it, and Joy certainly knew it. Anne's smile steadied, though it was no longer the same one she had walked in with. Her fingers intertwined on the table, knuckles paling as she leaned slightly toward the panel. "A name," she began softly, "is only dangerous when it's used without thought. I try to make sure mine isn't." The words were measured, deliberate, an actor accustomed to scripts now improvising in real time. But behind the control, there was weight. Years of public life, of headlines warped and motives misread, seemed to press against her back. Joy didn't flinch. "Then tell me this, when you speak about political issues, when you march, when you donate, you don't think that influences people? You don't think that shifts opinion?" Anne's gaze didn't waver. "It does, but influence isn't inherently corruption. Influence can also be protection. For people who are unheard, unseen, or silenced." She spoke with the cadence of someone who'd stood in rallies, who'd read letters that never made it past a newsroom's editorial desk. She didn't list them yet, but her eyes carried the weight of their contents. The panel shifted in their chairs. One host glanced toward the control room, as if anticipating a producer's voice in their earpiece. Somewhere in the crowd, applause started small at first, hesitant, as though uncertain whether it was permitted. Joy raised her hand slightly, quieting it. "You see," Joy said, her tone deceptively conversational, "that's exactly the problem. The more people look to celebrities for guidance, the less they listen to facts." The words hung there, the studio bright, yet suddenly feeling much smaller. Anne inhaled slowly, her next words pressing at the edge of her lips, carrying the promise of both defiance and truth. Joy's voice had shifted less like a talk show host, more like a litigator laying the groundwork for a cross-examination. Her tone was precise, the phrasing deliberate, each word placed like a chess piece meant to corner. "You've donated millions," she said, leaning back slightly as if giving Anne space to hang herself with her own rope. "But what about systemic change? What about the roots of the problem?" Anne didn't look away. A muscle in her jaw tightened. her gaze fixed not just on Joy, but on the invisible line between them, one that separated intent from perception. "I'm not here to say my contributions are a cure," Anne replied evenly. "They're part of a larger fight. They always have been." Her voice softened, but her words cut deeper. "I've supported Time's Up, the ACLU, organizations working on voting rights. I've sat with people whose lives have been wrecked by policies most of us never think twice about. You can't look them in the eye and say, 'I'll wait for a perfect solution before I help.'" Joy's eyebrow arched. "And yet, money isn't healing, is it?" The question landed like a gavel strike. Anne's eyes flickered, an admission, but also a spark of defiance. "No," she said quietly. "It's not enough. I know it. That's why I keep showing up." The audience stilled. No coughing, no shuffling, just the sharp hum of stage lights and the weight of an unflinching truth dot. In that moment, Anne wasn't just defending her record. She was defending the sincerity of trying, of acting without guarantees, of standing in the arena knowing the blows would come anyway. And Joy, watching her carefully, knew the exchange had just shifted from a polite interview into something far more personal. Joy's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, as if she could physically close the distance between herself and Anne. "Your side," she began slowly, "politicizes tragedy. You take pain, real pain, and you turn it into a rallying cry. Tell me, how do you remain human in that process?" The word struck not as an accusation alone, but as a moral challenge. The kind that strips away prepared talking points and demands something raw. Anne's breath caught, just for a moment. She glanced down at her hands, fingers slightly trembling, and then back up, meeting Joy's gaze without flinching. "By listening," she said. "By remembering that every issue we debate here is someone's life out there." She spoke of a refugee mother she had met during a UN trip, her daughter clutching a torn stuffed bear. She recalled reading emails from women who had fled abusive homes, who found courage in hearing someone with a platform speak out. Her voice was steady, but the weight of those memories pressed against each syllable. "This isn't about winning arguments," Anne continued. "It's about not turning away when the stories hurt too much to hold." Joy's tone shifted, less fire, more probing curiosity. "And yet, doesn't the stage, the cameras blunt the reality of it? Doesn't it become performance?" Anne hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Sometimes the stage blinds me. I'm human. I get caught in my own echo. But the stories keep pulling me back. That's what keeps me from disappearing into it." The audience was utterly still. And in that stillness, it was clear this conversation was no longer about celebrity or politics. It was about the uneasy place where ideology collides with humanity, and the cost of staying there. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tightening of Joy's expression, a subtle spark in her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, allowing a beat of silence to hang between them, letting anticipation coil in the air. Then she reached for her note cards. "I have here," she began, tapping the stack against the desk for emphasis, "a few headlines, viral tweets, critiques from people who don't buy this polished sincerity of yours." The audience murmured, sensing the edge in her voice. She read the first aloud. "Anne Hathaway's activism is just another Hollywood virtue signal." The words, stripped of nuance, sounded harsher in the cold studio air. Anne's gaze dropped for half a second, long enough for the camera to catch it before she looked back at Joy. "That quote left out the context," she said, her tone even but edged. "It was part of a smear that cherry-picked my words from a larger interview. The same one where I talked about doing the work." Quietly, off camera, Joy lifted another card. Her philanthropy is shallow optics. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Anne's fingers curled slightly against the table. I've learned that people will decide your motives for you, no matter what you do. But if my optics, feed families, fund legal aid, or keep shelters open, then I'll accept that criticism. The exchange was no longer a polite spar. It was a deposition under hot lights. Every word entered into the record of public opinion. Somewhere in the crowd, a man muttered, "She's holding her own." Cameras caught Joy's micro smile, whether from respect or strategy, no one could tell. But the tone of the room had shifted again. The tension was no longer just ideological, it was personal, layered with years of media distortion and the unspoken challenge of surviving under relentless scrutiny. The room felt like it had shrunk. The lights bore down with courtroom intensity, every reflection off the polished desk casting sharp edges across the panelists' faces. Joy sat angled toward Anne now, her body language openly adversarial, but not hostile. A litigator circling a witness who had held up under more fire than expected. "If Hollywood joins the fray," Joy began, her tone calm but precise, "nuance is lost. Complex issues get flattened into slogans, applause lines, hashtags, and the public starts mistaking performance for policy." And leaned forward, closing the gap between them, her voice low but steady. "Nuance is lost when we stay silent. Silence is where lies grow. If we have a platform and we choose not to use it, we're complicit." The audience reacted a low ripple of approval, mixed with a few scattered groans. It wasn't clean applause. It was the messy, real-time sorting of loyalties. Joy pressed on. "But you can't claim to be above the fray when you're part of it. You've spoken on voting rights, climate, reproductive freedoms. You've been on panels with activists. You've spoken at marches. That's not neutrality. That's taking sides." Anne didn't blink. "I've never claimed neutrality. I've claimed responsibility. I've sat in rooms where policy decisions were treated like chess moves, while the people those decisions affect weren't even considered part of the game. If speaking against that makes me partisan, so be it." The two women held each other's gaze, a silent beat heavy with defiance, respect, and the knowledge that neither would concede the point. Around them, the audience wasn't just watching. They were leaning forward, absorbing every line like a jury deliberating in real time. The ideological trial was in full swing, and every sentence carried the weight of evidence. Anne's shoulders lowered just slightly, as though the tension in her spine had loosened enough to let something unguarded through. The fight in her eyes didn't vanish, it simply settled, becoming steadier, heavier. She drew in a slow breath, her hands folding together on the desk. "I am not perfect," she said, her voice quieter now, but more deliberate than it had been all morning. "I don't pretend my words can fix the world. They have limits. I have limits." The audience leaned in instinctively. Even Joy, who had been holding her posture like a fencer on guard, tilted her head the slightest degree. "But my silence," Anne continued, "would echo louder than anything I've ever said. And that echo would be complicity. It wasn't defiance, it was confession." The cadence shifted from the tight volleys of debate into something softer, almost intimate, though the cameras were still rolling. She spoke of a march she had joined just weeks earlier, where she'd stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers chanting in the rain for voting access. She recalled the sound of a teenage girl's voice beside her, hoarse from shouting, but unwavering. "That's what I think about," Anne said. "Not the headlines, not the backlash, that girl's voice. Because she's the one who will inherit what we leave behind." Joy studied her. No smile, no rebuttal. The studio was silent, but for the hum of equipment and the faint rustle of Anne. Audience holding their breath. It was less a point scored than a moment claimed. A pause in the trial where the witness, instead of answering, turns the question back on the entire room. The silence stretched a fraction too long, the kind that begins to feel like a shift in gravity. Somewhere in the control room, a producer's voice crackled faintly through the panel's earpieces. But neither Joy nor Anne moved to break the stillness. Then, Anne's chair made the smallest sound-a-soft click as she adjusted her position. It wasn't enough to register as a gesture of retreat, but it carried an undercurrent, a warning. She uncrossed her legs, placed her hands flat on the table, and met Joy's eyes one final time. "I think we've said what needs to be said," she murmured. Joy's brow arched, her expression unreadable. "Are you walking away from the question?" Anne's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "No, I'm walking away from the frame of it." And with that, she stood. The scrape of her chair's legs on the floor cut through the studio like a blade. The audience gasped, the collective intake of breath snapping the moment into history. She didn't raise her voice, didn't look for applause. She simply stepped back from the desk, her heels clicking against the polished stage floor as she turned toward the wings. "Anne?" Joy's voice followed, not pleading, not mocking, but sharp with the recognition that something irreversible had just happened. The cameras caught every second. The straight line of Anne's back as she left. The audience's frozen expressions. The panel's scattered glances at one another. The live tension suddenly spilling into off-script territory. And then she was gone, slipping past the curtain, leaving only the faint echo of her steps behind. For a long moment, no one spoke. The studio lights still blazed, but the space felt colder, as if her absence had pulled the air from the room. The footage hit the internet before the next segment of the show had even finished airing. Clips appeared on social media in jagged, out-of-context bursts. Anne's steady gaze, Joy's pointed questions, the unmistakable sound of the chair sliding back. Hashtags bloomed within minutes, some in solidarity, others dripping with derision. News ran the loop on repeat, each outlet bending it to fit their own narrative. One chyron blared. Hathaway storms off set in political clash. Another softened it to actress ends interview early after intense exchange. The press room became a hive of speculation. Publicists, media strategists, and political commentators picked apart her body language, her choice of words, the timing of her exit. Was it a principled stand? A loss of composure? A deliberate media play? The interpretations split along familiar fault lines, those who saw courage and those who saw vanity. Twitter, a clip from a political analyst gained traction. The problem isn't that she left. The problem is why she felt she had to. This is what happens when public discourse turns into a performance scorecard. It was shared thousands of times, igniting new debates about the toxicity of televised confrontation. Anne's team released a short statement the next morning, MEASURED, and unsentimental. Ms. Hathaway concluded the interview after making her position clear. She stands by her statements and believes in the importance of respectful discourse. Joy's camp offered its own framing, praising spirited conversation and noting that The View had always welcomed challenging discussions. But online, the conversation was already beyond either camp's control. Every screenshot, every freeze frame, became its own courtroom exhibit in the trial of public opinion. And in that court, the jury was anyone with a Wi-Fi connection and an opinion to give. The noise didn't fade, it evolved. Weeks after the View moment, the conversation had seeped into op-eds, panel discussions, even university lectures. Professors dissected it as a case study in media ethics. Late-night hosts turned it into comedy fodder. But somewhere between this, memes and the moral essays, the moment stopped belonging to just Anne Hathaway. It became a mirror for an entire culture's appetite for conflict. Anne's career didn't crumble. In fact, her next public appearance a keynote at a journalism ethics conference drew more coverage than any film premiere she'd ever attended. She took the stage not in designer silk, but in a simple dark suit. No stylistic armor, no Hollywood gloss. She began without preamble. The camera can tell the truth, but it can also frame a lie. That day on The View, I realized the difference isn't in the lens, it's in the intent of the person holding it. She spoke for 20 uninterrupted minutes, weaving the studio confrontation into a larger narrative about how fame intersects with responsibility, and how the public's hunger for spectacle corrodes the space for sincerity. It wasn't a defense, it was an indictment of the very stage on which she stood, a refusal to let her life be just another viral fragment. When she finished, there was no roaring applause, only a long-waited silence. And then, slowly, a standing ovation that began in the back and rolled forward like a tide. The footage from that day went viral, too, but this time stripped of mockery. The same public who had watched her bristle under the studio lights now saw the full arc, a clash, a reckoning, and a reclamation. Poetic justice had not arrived in a courtroom, it had arrived in clarity. And in that clarity, Anne had taken back the narrative, one word at a time. The Manhattan skyline was dark, restless, dotted with the glow of late-night offices and the steady red blink of rooftop beacons. Inside a small Soho cafe, one that didn't trade in paparazzi shots or influencer clientele, Anne sat in a corner booth, her hair pulled back, reading from a leather notebook. No cameras, no mics, just ink and paper. Across the street, a muted television in a laundromat replayed the View clip yet again, the infamous moment between her and Joy looping with endless commentary below. She noticed it only in her periphery, and for once, she didn't feel the urge to turn away or to correct. The narrative. The moment no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a scar, closed and clean. Her phone buzzed. A text from her publicist. CNN wants you for a live sit-down about media ethics. Your call. Anne didn't reply right away. She took a sip of her coffee, feeling the warmth in her hands, the quiet hum of the cafe. It struck her that this stillness was the truest counterpoint to all the noise. She glanced at the TV across the street one last time, then turned her attention back to her notebook. With deliberate strokes, she wrote, "If you can't choose the story the world tells about you, then write the one you can live with." Outside, snow began to fall, softening the hard edges of the city. In the reflection of the window, Anne caught her own gaze steady now, no longer searching for vindication. Just forward, fade to black, the studio lights burned hotter than Anne remembered. Not the cozy amber glow of the View, but a stark, surgical brightness ANN's flagship set, the one reserved for high-stakes interviews. The kind where silence was as dangerous as any question. She sat across from James Ellery, a journalist whose reputation rested on a scalpel-sharp mind and an unflinching moral compass. The opening graphic faded, and instantly there was no warm-up banter. Ellery, "Ms. Hathaway, your clash with Joy Behar ignited a national conversation. Critics say you dodged accountability that day. Why sit here now?" Anne met his gaze, steady. "Anne, because this isn't about winning an argument. It's about telling the truth when the noise has faded." Ellery leaned in. "Ellery, then let's be direct. Do celebrities have a moral obligation to understand the impact of their words on politics?" Anne's reply came with no pause, no carefully engineered softness. "Anne, yes, but so do journalists, politicians, and every single person with a vote. Responsibility doesn't end with fame. It starts with being informed." The tension in the studio was different from the View. There was no jeering audience, no panel to scatter focus. Just her voice, lived to millions, unbuffered. Ellery's brow furrowed. "Ellery, some call that a dodge spreading the blame." Anne's tone cooled. "Anne, no. It's a refusal to accept a narrative where public responsibility is selective." That story serves the powerful, not the truth. The silence afterward was deafening. Even the control room, visible through the glass, seemed frozen. In that moment, Anne realized this was no longer about defending herself. It was about defining the fight. Fade out. The interview wasn't even 20 minutes old before the first. Ripples hit. Inside CNN's executive suite, the phones lit up. Not from viewers, but from political offices. Anne had spoken about selective responsibility, and somewhere in that phrasing, powerful ears heard an accusation. The kind they didn't want replayed on the 6 p.m. loop. Back in the green room, Anne was pulling on her coat when her publicist, Marissa, stepped in, face pale. "Marissa, we have a problem." She handed Anne her phone. The trending feed was a battlefield. Anne tells truth climbing fast. Boycott Hathaway right behind it. Short, clipped statement from a CNN vice president. The network does not endorse the political views of guests. Anne exhaled slowly. That was fast. But the bigger blow came minutes later. A senior producer approached, eyes darting toward the hallway. "Producer, off the record?" The higher-ups are furious. "You embarrassed someone they can't afford." "To embarrass. There's talk of pulling the segment from reruns." Anne's jaw tightened. So the truth is dangerous when it's inconvenient. The producer's voice dropped even lower. "Producer, dangerous doesn't cover it. You just became the story. And in this business, that's not survival. That's a target." As she left the building, cameras swarmed her, lights flashing like the studio glare she'd just escaped. But Anne didn't flinch. The war had moved from the stage to the shadows, and she was ready. In the dark glass of the SUV door, she caught her own reflection and saw not the actress, not the celebrity, but the fighter, fade out. Anne's penthouse was usually a quiet refuge, all glass walls and city lights. Tonight, it felt like a war room. Her team, Marissa, the publicist, David, the agent, and 2 media strategists sat around the dining table. Laptops glowed, phones buzzed with push alerts, and the tension was thick enough to slice. "David, we ride this out. The outrage will peak in 48 hours and then fade." "Marissa, that's wishful thinking. This isn't just trending, it's being fed. Someone wants her buried." One of the strategists slid a USB stick across the table. "Strategist, we have something you should hear." Anne plugged it into her laptop. The audio was raw, shaky, recorded from a phone in someone's pocket. It was the views backstage, just minutes before she walked out. Joy Behar's voice was unmistakable, laced with irritation. "She's going to try and play the victim. I'll handle her." A murmur followed, another voice chuckling about putting her in her place. Then a producer's voice, low but clear. "Just make sure it's good TV." Anne leaned back, eyes narrowing. They went in with a plan. "Marissa, if this gets out, it changes the narrative. People will see it wasn't a clash, it was an ambush." "David, it'll also burn bridges with one of the most powerful networks in daytime television. You'll never get invited back. Anywhere." Anne stood, crossing to the window, staring at the glittering Manhattan skyline. "Anne, if staying silent means letting them rewrite the truth, what's the point of having a voice?" No one spoke. The only sound was the muted hum of the city far below. Finally, Anne turned back, decision blazing in her eyes. "Anne, we leak it, and not through the tabloids, through independent media. If we're going down telling the truth." Marissa's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "Marissa, then let's make it impossible for them to bury. You fade to black."